to LSE. My name is Brian here. I'm a research fellow and also the director of the Hayek program, which is organizing tonight's discussion. Before I introduce tonight's event, let me just encourage all of you to think about our future events. So if you haven't already done so, I encourage you to check out our Eventbrite site. You can simply Google LSE Hayek program and you'll be led to this particular page. We host various online webinars and also in-person lectures here at the LSE. I would like to point your attention to two in particular. Next week on the 12th of March, we have a book launch on recession, what to do about it, why economies shrink and what to do about it. That's going to feature Dr. Tyler Goodspeed, who was formerly the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the United States. So he's a prominent economist and will be launching his book here with us next week. And then the following week, we have an event called Evaluating Green Industrial Policy, where it's also a new book that's launched by several Swedish economists who are really critically evaluating, the merits and effectiveness of green industrial policy as an economic strategies and an environmental strategy as well. Right? So I encourage you to really check these out. So on to tonight's event. Please take note that we will have 45 minutes of speaking by our speaker, and then 45 minutes of Q&A, and our event is going to stretch all the way to 8 p.m. Do take note that tonight's event is recorded and will be uploaded on YouTube in the coming weeks. Alright, so let me just now introduce our speaker. So Dr. Steve Davies is Senior Academic Fellow of the John Locke Institute. From 1979 to 2009, he was Senior Lecturer in the Department of History and Economic History at Manchester Metropolitan University, and was then Head of Education at the Institute for Economic Affairs. He writes regularly for the Daily Telegraph. His published books include Empiricism and History, The Streetwise Guide to the Devil and His Works, and Apocalypse Next, The Economics of Global Catastrophic Risks, as well as the topic of tonight's talk, The Great Realignment, Why the New Right is Here to Stay. And finishing off our panel, we have Mr. Mani Bashazad, who is an economic journalist. So he will be part of the panel and will help me to moderate tonight's question and answer session. All right, so without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Steve Davies. Thank you very much.
Right. Thanks very much, Brian. And thank you for all of you for coming along to this event here, and to Brian for hosting me. As he intimated, this is about my most recent book, which came out in January, The Great Realignment, why the New Right is Here to Stay. The subtitle, by the way, is not said with any sense of satisfaction on my part. It's a rather gloomy conclusion, as far as I'm concerned, because the kind of politics I'm going to talk about is not one that I welcome. In fact, it's the diametric opposite of what I believe. But what I'm presenting here is an analysis of why politics, since about 2005 roughly, has taken the course that it has in one country after another around the world. Pretty much every developed country, apart from a few, Ireland for example, until recently Australia, but that is no longer true, as recent opinion polls in Australia indicate. Japan, but again that's not true either there. And many middle-income countries as well, notably India, but also Turkey, quite a few countries in Latin America, notably Peru and Brazil. So what I'm going to do in the talk is to explain to you really what the thesis of the book is, the argument that I'm presenting, and it's an argument about what is going on in contemporary politics that explains things like the success of Donald Trump, the Brexit vote in the UK, the rise of so-called populist right-wing parties around many parts of the world, and also then what drives this, and with some stuff at the end which isn't so much in the book, about where I think we're likely to be going, although as a historian I'm very cautious about predicting the future. So that's the argument really. As you can see, since about 2005, this is the main argument. There's been a realignment of politics in one country after another, and I'll explain in a moment what I mean by a realignment, because there's a kind of high-level political theory there. In one country after another, what you've seen is the appearance of a new kind of politics, a kind of politics usually, and in my view rather misleadingly, described as populist. The politics, for example, of Marine Le Pen and the National Rally in France, the AfD in Germany, the Sweden Democrats in Sweden, Viktor Orban's government, Fidesz in Hungary, the PIS in Poland, Donald Trump in the United States, or here in the UK, UKIP, and then subsequently Reform and whatever the latest vehicle Nigel Farage has, and of course most recently Rupert Lowe and Restore Britain. You've seen this kind of politics appearing all over the place. As I said, there are some countries where for a while it didn't seem to appear. So it looked for a while a few years ago as though it hadn't yet occurred in Spain or in Portugal, but in fact it's broken through there, and we now have Chega, which is a party of this kind, the second largest party in Portugal. The Vox party has emerged in Spain. The only European country where this kind of politics has not yet arisen is the Irish Republic. And even there, you've had mass popular street demonstrations and a kind of mass popular insurgency almost, which espouses and puts forward the same kind of views that elsewhere are found in formally structured parties. Australia was another country where it appeared that this had not yet manifested, but the latest opinion polls for various state or federal elections in Australia indicate that Pauline Hanson's One Nation, Lord help all the Australians, is now the second ranking party in the country by first preference voting, and is set, on current indications anyway, to replace the Liberal National Alliance. So this is what's been going on in one country after another, and the argument is that this is a realignment. Now, in some countries, and I list several there, the US, France, Germany, Poland, this realignment is pretty much complete. In other countries, like Spain, Portugal, for example, it's just getting going. There are other countries where it hasn't yet appeared, and there are some, of which I would count the UK and Canada as the most prominent examples, maybe Australia as well, where although it's happened amongst voters, it hasn't yet happened at the level of electoral results, and that reflects partly the impact of the electoral system and partly the way in which this realignment, which I'm going to explain in a moment, has happened amongst voters but hasn't happened among donors. And when you have a political system which is unusually dependent, as ours is, upon private donations from wealthy individuals, they have an outsized impact upon the form that politics takes. And this realignment hasn't really taken place amongst that class, the class of political investors. And as it says here, this is what the realignment is about. The argument is that since about the 1920s, in the UK anyway, a number of other countries, politics was ultimately, primarily, everywhere about economics. It was about the choice between socialism or capitalism, between a greater or lesser degree of market role in the economy as compared to government intervention in the economy. And my argument essentially is that this is no longer true, that we have moved into a world in which economic issues are no longer the primary dividing and driving forces in politics. Instead, we have a new kind of issue. And as I say, the bottom line here, it's about collective identity and the nature of the political community. And if you want to put it in a kind of slogan-like headline, instead of being capitalism versus socialism, it's nationalism versus cosmopolitanism, I would say. That's the kind of, like, one sentence, rather crude way of summing it up. So what is the theory behind this, the kind of high-level theory? Well, the argument goes roughly like this. In every political community, and this includes, by the way, ones where the politics is oligarchic, like, say, medieval Europe, what you find is that there are lots and lots of things that people disagree about and debate about. So if you think about any modern political community, you can probably list between 30 and 40 issues that people disagree about and which are thought to be appropriate for political discussion. In other words, it's thought to be appropriate that these differences of opinion be settled through the mechanism of collective political choice. Not all things that people disagree about are settled that way, of course. There are lots of issues like, whether or not Arsenal's football tactics are ruining the Premier League and all that kind of thing, which we don't settle through politics, but there are many that we do. Now, if you think about it, the number of ways you can combine even a binary view of 30 issues is an enormously large number. It's about 30 factorial, basically, which is a colossally huge number. But that's not what you find. What you find in reality is, first of all, that certain kinds of political views cluster together, and often in ways that, in terms of pure philosophy or logic, don't necessarily make sense. So, for example, there's no logical or necessary reason why, if you're in favour of a free market economy, you should also favour the death penalty. Those two issues are not the same kind of issue. But in reality, as a sociological matter, you do find, historically, that that is a very common combination. That if you are in favour of a broadly free market approach to the economy, you're disproportionately likely, way more likely, to favour the capital punishment and be opposed to it. That was certainly the case until historically very recently. And this is a sociological matter. It tells you the reality that the way in which people's disagreements about those many, many things that people in any political community will disagree about, the way they align is driven by various kinds of structural sociological factors. And I should highlight something I'll come back to later, which is that I take a broadly materialist view of this rather than an idealist one. Not a Marxist one, by the way, more an analyst one, so it's Braudel rather than Marx who is the driver in this. But what you find is that there's one of those issues, one of those 30, is particularly important. This is particularly salient. It matters to an awful lot of people, and it matters a lot to them. That's because that one issue typically reflects or grows out of fundamental or structural divisions of interest within the society. These may be economic, they may be to do with identity, they may be to do with, say, religion or ethnicity, but whatever it is, it's an issue that divides that society at a very profound level. And this is the aligning issue. Politics is structured around it, and it divides politics in a binary way, so that you end up with two sides. And politics, in pretty much every complex political order, I would argue, has a fundamentally binary quality. And there's a simple reason for that. There's one fundamental division in politics which can only be binary, and that is being in power or out of power. You cannot be a little bit in power. That's like being a little bit pregnant. It's an impossible condition. And so, therefore, when you have an issue which divides the society in a fundamental way, like that, the question then becomes, are you in power and able to effect your views on that fundamental, highly salient issue, or are you not? And this produces the binary division, which we classically in the post-1789 world label as left and right. But one of the points, which I'll return to in a moment, is that those categories of left and right do not have fixed meanings. They come to change quite fundamentally and dramatically at various points in time. And so, as it says here, what happens is that people's views on that single aligning issue determine which side of that binary divide they place themselves. It determines whether they see themselves as being on the, if you like, quote, left, unquote, or right, unquote. At the same time, it also enables them to identify allies, friends, and foes. If you agree with somebody in the primary issue, you're on broadly the same side. If you disagree on that issue, you're broadly on opposite sides. Never mind the fact that you may agree with the person on the other side about a whole range of secondary issues, which are less salient, less important to you, or that you may be in strong disagreement with somebody on your own side on that aligning issue about, again, the matters of secondary importance. And also, it tells you the way you react to that aligning issue enables you to locate yourself within one of the two sides. So when the main division was over economics and it was socialism versus capitalism, if you were an extreme free marketeer, a laissez-faire advocate, that put you on one extreme of one half. Conversely, if you were a full-on Stalinist communist or a Leninist, that put you on an extreme of the other one. Conversely, you could find yourself and define yourself as being centre-left or centre-right. Now, what you also find, though, is that typically among the secondary issues, there's one, sometimes two, that is also very important, again, because it reflects divisions. And that produces a familiar pattern in politics, which is that of roughly a quadrant, a kind of four-way division of voters, produced by the interaction of the primary divide, the aligning divide and the secondary divide. Sometimes there's 2 and you get 8, but that's actually quite unusual. And you very seldom find that all 8 of the possible cells actually have any significant number of people in them. Now, what you find is that, therefore, the secondary issue tends to determine or drive the competition for voters or support in a democratic system between the 2 sides of the primary division. And that's how the things work out. We'll see this in a moment. Now, what happens, though, is that these alignments are not permanent. They typically last in one form for about 40 to 50 years, and you periodically see realignments in politics in which the main dividing issue changes. Sometimes it's the secondary one, sometimes it's the major one. My argument is that what we've seen in the last 10, 15 years across most of the world is a major realignment. The last time we had such a realignment was back in the very early part of the 20th century in most countries. The precise dates vary from one country to another. We had a secondary realignment in many Western countries in the 1960s and 1970s when the secondary issue changed. A new secondary issue arose, as we'll see in a moment. So this is the political alignment we had between the 1970s, when we had a secondary realignment, until recently. So basically the bottom line, the bottom axis, was the aligning issue. And essentially, if you're at the extreme right end of that, you're someone like, Ludwig von Mises, you're a laissez-faire capitalist. Maybe a bit more extreme, you're Murray Rothbard. If you're at the other extreme, the left extreme of that axis, you're Pol Pot. Or a bit inside of that, someone like Mao. And obviously you can fill in different people in the middle. Now the vertical axis, on the other hand, is the secondary issue, and that's basically one that arose in the 1960s, and it's social liberalism versus social conservatism. So if you're at the top of that axis, you're John Stuart Mill. You basically think that individual autonomy and the demands of individual self-realization, human flourishing, demand that people should be pretty much allowed to do whatever they like in terms of their personal life, as long as they don't directly and immediately harm other people. So you're fine with people being gay, you're fine with gay rights of all kinds, you're okay with abortion, you're fine with people practicing, all kinds of experiments in living, as Mill called them. On the other hand, if you're down at the bottom of that vertical axis, then you're someone who thinks that one of the central roles of government is to enforce traditional moral norms. Of course, what they are varies from one society to another. But the point is, you think that actually these are not matters of private choice or personal choice. These are matters that the state has an actual interest in intervening in. You're Peter Hitchens, basically. If you ever read Peter's columns in the Daily Mail, you'll know what I'm talking about. And so this produces the four-way divide that I see I've got up here in this chart. In the upper left quadrant, you've got the people I've called social democrats. And these are people who are broadly left of centre on economics. They favour a large welfare state, they favour government regulation of the economy, they maybe at one end favour quite extensive government regulation, state ownership of major industries, but they're also very socially liberal. They're in favour of abortion, they're in favour of sexual liberty or personal lifestyle choice. At the opposite quadrant, you've got the people I call free market conservatives, who are pro-market economics, very often very much so. They're opposed to the welfare state, but they're also strong cultural conservatives. They're social authoritarians in various ways. And you can see how that is. That's basically Thatcherite conservatives versus the Labour Party since the 1960s. It's the Republican Party versus the Democratic Party in the United States. It's the CDU, CSU versus the SPD. That's the basic division you can see everywhere. And that leaves two quadrants, and these are the quadrants that the parties compete for over the course of the last 40 years. The upper right quadrant, which is about 15–16% of the electorate in the Anglosphere, is what I've called the consistent libertarians. They are against government on both axes. They're in favour of both a market economy, limited government economic role, but they're also in favour of social liberty, social liberalism. They're consistent John Stuart Mill followers, you could say. On the other side, you've got consistent authoritarians. These are people who are very often very left-wing on economics, but they're also strongly socially conservative and traditionalist in their attitudes. The French Communist Party, for example, under Maurice Thoré and others subsequently, that fits classically into that quadrant. Same is true for large numbers of more traditional blue-collar voters in the United States. So that was the division. Very quickly, during the 1980s, roughly, the free market conservatives were able to get a large number of the consistent authoritarians to vote for them because of that secondary axis. So in the United States, for example, things like abortion, busing of African American children and white children to equalise the balance in schools, issues like that tended to play in the interests of the free market conservatives, and they got a lot of votes from so-called Reagan Democrats who voted for them. And so throughout the 1980s, because the free market conservatives got a lot of votes from that consistent authoritarian bloc, they were able to win. Meanwhile, they still got all the votes of the upper right, the consistent libertarians, because the people in that quadrant, it turns out, thought that tax cuts were more important to them than the social liberalism. They didn't like the social conservatism of their conservative allies, but they were prepared to put up with that because they wanted tax cuts more. But then, from about the mid-90s onwards, 2090s onwards, the Social Democrats moved sharply to the right on economics. You got the rise of classic neoliberalism, as I would call it, with people like Blair, Schroeder, Clinton, and the result was that they then got a significant number of the consistent libertarians to vote for them because they were now, no longer prepared to put up with the conservatism of the free market conservatives, and they no longer feared that the Social Democrats were going to put their taxes up so much. And so you had a period when the upper left quadrant was in the ascendancy, and you ended up with a kind of rather sterile, static politics in which both left and right, defined by the old alignment, settled on a kind of technocratic approach to politics in which there was no longer a kind of existential or principled choice to be made. It was all about who would run politics more efficiently. Now, this is the new alignment. This is the one that you can see appearing in one country after another. The bottom axis is still the economic one, but that is now the secondary axis. It's no longer the primary division, and it's also fading in importance. One of the things I expect to happen in the next decade, in fact less than that, 5 or 6 years, is that within about 5 or 6 years, free market radicals like me and real, definite socialists will both become a kind of eccentric minority. There'll be about 10% of each of us, and about 80% of people, and more importantly, the overwhelming majority of the economic elite, are going to basically settle on Chinese-style neo-mercantilism as the dominant economic strategy. I don't welcome this. I think this is really bad, by the way, but I think that's the way we're going. And so this is the new alignment. The new dominant axis is now the vertical one. And what this supposes is at the top, cosmopolitans, and at the bottom, nationalists. So what are the kind of issues that divide them? Well, if you're at the top, if you're a cosmopolitan, then you are broadly in favour of international governance systems, the so-called rule-governed international order. You favour a system in which there are structures that limit the power of national governments in various ways that are enforced by domestic courts and judicial systems. You are relaxed about immigration. You favour free trade and global capital flows. You are in favour of a broadly cosmopolitan world, and you look forward to a world in which the power of national governments to do things like, going and bombing other countries and so on, is severely restrained and cut back. If, on the other hand, you're on the bottom of this new dominant axis, then you are a nationalist. You think that the nation, defined in rather thick identitarian terms, is the primary unit of human society, and that it has a kind of claim upon the loyalty of the people who inhabit a political community that trumps other kind of claims and obligations. And you think that in terms of both economics and more importantly, things like defining who has a right to live or work within a given part of the planet's surface, it's the nation that should come first. And so if you're at the bottom nationalist end, then you're likely to be a protectionist economically. You're likely to favour a national industrial strategy of one kind or another. You're going to be very hostile to immigration. You're going to be very hostile to supranational governance, including institutions like the EU. And you can see that this produces then what I call the new alignment. On the upper right quadrant, you've got what I call the cosmopolitan liberals. The quintessential kind of figure in that kind of quadrant would be somebody like Emmanuel Macron. This is people who are broadly pro-market, but typically more egalitarian than the free market conservatives of the previous alignment, and they're also pro-social liberty, and they're strongly cosmopolitan. Then in the opposite quadrant, you have the national collectivists. The national collectivists are in favour of a broadly dirigiste economy. They like the welfare state, as long as it is a national welfare state for national citizens. They are in favour of an economic strategy in which the state promotes national economic development, neo-mercantilism. They don't like the global financial system that we have now. They're also, as I say, strongly nationalist. They emphasise a very kind of traditional thick notion of what national identity is, a kind of blood and soil notion, if you want to stereotype it, but certainly one that is not a matter of personal choice. It's the kind of view that, for example, Matt Goodwin was putting during the, lots of his blogs and also during the by-election, recent by-election where he was a candidate, which is where, Rishi Sunak is not British, not English, because he's got Indian ethnicity. It's that kind of idea of national identity. By the way, the extreme version of this, which you get in the United States, is the idea of what is called heritage Americans, which means that you can't call yourself an American unless you have ancestors who have lived in the United States before 1860. So according to that definition, Tony Soprano is not an American. Nor is Donald Trump, by the way, despite the fact that many of these people are Trump fans. So that's the national collectivists. And you can easily identify who these people are. They're the people I spoke about earlier. These are the new kinds of parties that are appearing all over the world. People like Marine Le Pen, Jordan Bardella, the AFD, the Sweden Democrats, particularly someone like Rupert Lowe, Restore, that kind of tendency in Britain. It's also people like Erdogan, Narendra Modi. He's very much a politician of that kind. Then you've got the two remaining quadrants. You've got the radical left, which is people like the Green Party here in the UK, people like, say, for example, Zoran Mamdani in the United States. It's a kind of combination of strong cosmopolitanism with strongly anti-neoliberal left economics, basically. The big problem for that group, by the way, is that they don't yet have a clear idea of how they would organise the international system, because they reject the existing international order because they see it as being essentially exploitative, but they don't have a clearly worked out alternative. And then down at the bottom you've got what I've called national liberals. Now that's the remnants of the old centre-right, and these are people who combine nationalism with quite strong free markets. So it's a kind of capitalism in one country model, if you want to adapt a well-known slogan. But very often this kind of group, which has begun to appear, takes the form of being more extreme on the nationalist spectrum while combining that with quite strong free markets. So you get that with Rupert Lowe, for example. You also get it with Eric Zemmour in France with the La Reconquête, currently in a bit of eclipse because he's been totally shafted by Le Pen. But also things like the Confederation Party in Poland, that's also very much in that kind of vein. Whereas the PIS, the Law and Justice Party, the former government, and currently holding the presidency, is very much the national collectivist. So that's the new alignment, and that's my view, is that what has happened over the last 10 years is that there's been a process of realignment in which we've moved from that old alignment to that new alignment. And one of the things that means is that many people suddenly find that without their views having changed, they suddenly find that their location on the left-right spectrum changes radically. I'm a very good example of this. So under the old alignment, I was regarded as being fairly radically right-wing. I always thought there were problems with that, to do with my views on various other issues, but nonetheless, that's where most people would locate me. Now, my views put me on the extreme left. And so, without my views having changed in the slightest, I've suddenly gone from one label, if you like, one grab bag to another. But the same thing can happen in many ways. Lots and lots of people suddenly find that without their views having changed, they've suddenly changed their alteration. And this is what historically happens with realignment. So let me give you a British example. We had a realignment in British politics in the 1880s between roughly 1881 and 1893, but particularly between 1886 and 1893. And if you'd gone up to somebody in 1881 and said that within 10 years, or less than 10 years actually, Joseph Chamberlain, the arch-radical dissenter, crypto-republican, was going to be in a government with the arch-reactionary Lord Salisbury, people would have thought, you're mad, you've been out in the sun too long with that hat. Well, not in Britain, but you know what I mean. But the reality was, of course, that after 1886, that's exactly what happened. And, Chamberlain led 90-odd Liberal MPs out of the Liberal Party in the great split over Irish Home Rule, and which wasn't really about Ireland, by the way, but that's another story. And he ended up, forming this new alliance with the Tories, the Unionist alliance, which went on to dominate politics until 1906. And with this, again, his own views have not changed, but his location in British politics has changed radically. And that's the kind of thing that happens during alignments. Oops, this isn't working now. Hang on a minute. How do I get this? Let me see if this works. Can you get the thing to move, the slides to progress? Yeah, there you go. There. Oh, right, okay. Right, here we go. So this is the basic description of it. As it says here, the new divide is nationalism versus cosmopolitanism. Now, what this means is, as it says here, there are free marketeers on both sides of this new alignment. There are economic interventionists, or economic collectivists, if you will, on both sides of the new alignment. So if you look at, for example, in the United States, you'll find that people like Senator Josh Hawley, for example, who's clearly a part of the new Trumpian right, if you look at what he thinks about economics and compare it to the views of, say, his fellow Senator Elizabeth Warren, there's an extraordinary overlap. They both dislike large corporations. They think that the federal government should be doing much more to rein in, particularly large tech companies. They both think that there should be a much more aggressive policy of the federal government directing investment, developing the national economy. This is concealed by the fact that they really don't like each other and disagree violently about issues like immigration and the now dominant issues of national identity. But the point I'm making is there are people who are economic interventionists on both sides. There are people who are free marketeers on both sides. Again, there are social liberals on both sides. There are social conservatives on both sides. That's because those issues are less salient. So a lot of head scratching over the fact that socially conservative Muslim voters in the UK would vote for a Green candidate. But that's not surprising. It's because if you are a Muslim voter in Manchester, where I'm from, by the way, you would, for you, the really big issue is immigration and cosmopolitanism. Sure, you know that you have socially conservative views that you don't share with Hannah Spencer, but you're still going to vote for her and the Green Party because for you, the issue that trumps that is the question of controls on immigration and definition of national identity. And so that means that now many of the divides that structured the old politics are now up for grabs because they're now distributed in a different way. And so what are the new issues? And as I say, I've got some of them here. The big one is immigration. You see this everywhere. But also more profoundly and related to that, the whole question of national identity and what it is. Is national identity something that is fundamentally ethnic? Is it the case that, for example, British identity is an ethnic one, something which is inherited, which means you have to have lived here for a very long time and had ancestors who lived for a very long time? Or is it something else? I should say, by the way, that Britain has never been an ethnic national state because we are a monarchical state and a dynastic state. The only thing that makes people British is that they owe allegiance to the crown. Not that they have a particular ethnic identity. Similarly, in the United States, of course, historically, as Ronald Reagan said in his farewell address, one of the great things about this country, he said, is that anyone can come here from anywhere in the world and become an American, because the United States was meant to be defined by allegiance to the principles of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And if you came from anywhere in the world and you took a vow that you would, adhere to those principles and you accepted them, that meant you were an American. And that's what the kind of current nativist kind of revival in American politics is trying to do it. So another one, but a big one, is the last two, global governance and law or democracy. I'll pass over the global governance bit because that's basically about whether or not people accept in the rule of institutions like the various kind of conventions, international treaties and the like, that to which national governments have bound themselves, if you will. But more to the point is the idea of law or democracy. This is perhaps the most acute political divide in the new alignment. On the one side, the national collectivists, as I call them, tend to assert a kind of majoritarian democracy. The idea that if the public votes for a particular, or wills a particular political outcome, they should have their way, they should get it. And this is opposed to the idea that there are certain things which the courts will simply not let you do. And one of the things that, if you like, really exasperates and enrages many of the voters for the national collectivists is the fact that, for example, they find that their preferred policies are very, very difficult to put into effect because courts strike them down. And the argument is that actually this is wrong, that the law should be subject to and overridden by the sovereign power of, if you like, the democratic populace. And then the contrary view, of course, is that actually, no, you don't want that. That regardless of what you may think about particular issues, you don't want a situation in which you have a population, a people, whatever that means, endowed with sovereign power, bearing in mind that a sovereign power is a power that has no check or limitation upon it, and which can basically do whatever it wills. Which is seen as being inherently dangerous. So that's really one of the big, big divisions at the moment. And so that's basically what there is. One of the interesting questions is about geopolitics, where there's an interesting division within this new right that I describe in my book, because a large number of the new right, particularly in continental Europe, are sceptical of or hostile towards the global order constructed by the United States and are therefore sceptical of the United States as a geopolitical actor. And this is one of the areas where you get surprising overlap between parties like, say, the AfD and the radical left. In Germany at the moment, if you see the responses of the AfD and the radical left to the current war going on in the Middle East and the American attack on Iran, you'll find that they're on pretty much the same page. Now, that's not as clear in other countries. In the UK, for example, the populist right is predominantly, certainly amongst its older representatives, very pro-American, and so you don't get that division, but you do find it elsewhere. So this is what you find when you look at the actual pattern of the new politics. You find a number of very clear divisions, and that's the big one at the top there. You find that electorally and socially and culturally, the big division is between globally connected large metropolitan areas and rural areas, small towns and ex-industrial areas. You can see this very clearly, for example, in the United States. If you look at the pattern of electoral results in the US, you've got like small areas of deep, deep blue, which is the core areas of metropolitan areas. Places like Hennepin County, Minnesota, for example, Philadelphia County properly in Pennsylvania, New York City, and these are solidly blue and very radically so. Conversely, you've got the small, the rural areas and also ex-industrial areas like, say, Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania, Mahoning Valley in Ohio, Youngstown, that is, which are solidly for Trump, for the populists. And then in between, you've got the suburbs, which are the swing votes, basically. That pattern is found everywhere. You can see it very clearly in India, for example. You can see it in Turkey. You can see it here. If you think about the Brexit vote, where you had a roughly 50-50 split, places like London, 75% Remain, places like the northeast of England, West Yorkshire, large parts of West Yorkshire, or the West Midlands, equally lopsidedly Leave. I do remember, by the way, one of my favourite moments in the vote came when at about 4 o'clock in the morning, and everyone was getting a bit tired, Cambridge voted something like 76% Remain, and David Dimbleby said, good to see an educated part of the country has voted. I thought, the mask of impartiality is slipping a bit there. Anyway, but there are others as well. One of them is older versus younger. Right now, this is a very clear division. You find that the older voters tend to support the populist right, the younger voters less so. Not everywhere, mind you. In France, for example, it's the other way round. In France, the younger voters are predominantly leaning towards Le Pen. Le Pen is by far the most popular politician amongst the under 30 voters in France. It's the older voters who support the status quo. And I predict, that's why I say there, for now, I think that what's going to happen is that as time passes, younger men, I'll come to that in a moment, are going to move over to the populist right. And so the idea that you can wait for older voters to die off and parties like Reform are going to disappear, I'm afraid, is a false hope, because I think their ranks are going to be replenished. But right now, it's older versus younger. But that's actually probably a proxy. I think the really important division is the next one, which is graduate versus non-graduate. The strongest predictor of how people will vote in most elections now is whether or not they are a graduate. If they've been to university and they're a graduate, they're overwhelmingly likely to be on the cosmopolitan side. Now, you might think this is because of the effect that being at a place like here, the LSE, has on people, the way their mind works, it opens their minds up in some way perhaps, but actually the evidence survey suggests that that's not the case, that it's rather that the people who are already leaning that way are more likely to go to university in the first place. And what university does is to kind of consolidate or crystallise the attitudes that they already have. But it is a very, very clear and strong division at the moment. There are also strong correlations with certain kinds of employment. The American author A.S. Lyons describes this as the split between virtuals versus physicals. Basically, people who work in occupations which involve the production of physical products or physical services like delivery tend to be more likely to vote for the populist nationalist right of this new alignment. People who work in virtual services, they produce globally traded non-physical products of various kinds, including finance, by the way, are more likely to be on the other side. And this, again, has all kinds of sociological reasons for that. There's definitely a split between women and men, at least under the age of 30. Under the age of 30, the gender gap is remarkably big, particularly in the United States, but increasingly in other countries. Basically, the women overwhelmingly fall on the kind of cosmopolitan side, the younger men increasingly fall on the nationalist side. There are all kinds of interesting questions as to why that is, and also about the implications it has for, amongst other things, dating between men and women, given that increasingly people say on both sides that they're not prepared to date someone whose political views they don't share. So that doesn't reflect well on our prospects for raising the birth rate. Then there's that other kind of thing, which is a case of an emphasis on inclusion versus an emphasis on clear identity. The point about a strong and clear identity is that by definition it is exclusive. If you have a clear identity, a shared identity, then by definition there must be people who are the other, who do not share that identity. And so there's a clear kind of division there. In terms of psychology, that relates to the Canoe model of openness versus closeness, if you follow the Big Five model of personality type. But there's also, fundamentally, a big division of sensibility and attitude. One of the clearest indications of this was when, just after the Brexit referendum, Campaign magazine, the marketing industry's in-house magazine, did a survey of what the favourite brands of Remainers and Leavers were. And they found that there was almost no overlap at all, and that the favourite brands correlated with the two positions of Remain and Leave, regardless of age. So the favourite brands for Leavers were things like Bisto, Hovis Bread, Cathedral City Cheddar, what was one of the other ones? But you can imagine the kind of thing. It was basically oh yes, Richmond sausages, that was another one. It was basically very traditional and rather provincial British brands, whereas the favourite brands for Remainers were the iPhone, Facebook, Instagram, London Transport, and EasyJet. So it was all things to do with high-tech global travel and the like. And this reflects a fundamental kind of difference of sensibility. Now, why has this happened? Well, in the book, I have a whole chapter where I argue about this. And my argument is that the key underlying driving factor of this is the way the world economy has developed since the later 1980s, or even since the collapse of Bretton Woods in 1971. My central argument is that we no longer live in a world of broadly national economies. We're no longer living in a world where it makes sense to talk about the British economy, the French economy, the American economy, and so on. What we're living now, rather, is a world in which the world economy is organised around an interconnected network of globally connected metropolitan areas, with the various metropolitan areas being nodes. And if you're familiar with the work of the Gawk Operation think tank up at Loughborough University, this is the kind of model that they articulate. And this means that we're in a completely different kind of world to the world that we were in. It no longer really makes sense to think about the British economy. What you've got is the London economy, and then you've got the economy of the rest of Britain. And part of the problem this country has is that the other city regions aren't that successful, really. Maybe Manchester, but nowhere else, certainly not Liverpool. And this has certain effects, and the big ones are the ones I've listed there. Mass migration, which is driven primarily, I argue in the book, by the transformation of agriculture in the global south, which has basically created about 2 billion redundant or soon-to-be redundant farmers who are moving to urban areas around the world. Most are moving to urban areas in the global south, but a significant number are moving to the north. Greater precarity, precarity in terms of employment, economic position, certainty about what you're going to do in life, basically. Life has become, you may be better off economically, but the whole economy has developed in a way that makes your life much less predictable, much less certain, much less in your control, basically. And also the development of a rules-bound international order. The reason why that has developed is because if you're going to have a globally integrated economy, you need uniform rules, because the kind of globally integrated supply chains production system that we now have can't cope with having a world in which national governments can abruptly change regulations that raise their costs on the basis of national economic choices. And that leads to a technocratic consensus, as I mentioned, after 1990. And there's a reaction against all this. Now, the important point, and this in a way where I'm wrapping up now, is that the economic transformations and the effects have left a lot of people feeling miserable and resentful. One of the other very strong predictors of people voting for either populist left or populist right is that they feel unhappy. If you ask these surveys where you say, how happy do you feel? And for a long while, most people said, on a score of none to 10, where, 10 is my life is perfect, nothing can be better, and 0 means, I want to kill myself now. Most people would score themselves as 7, but increasingly that's not the case. You now find that there's a much wider range. And typically people who say they feel generally unhappy or not very content with their life are much more likely to vote for either the populist left or the populist right, the two extremes of the new alignment. And so the result is you've had an economic driver, but it's not understood in economic terms. In other words, it's understood in terms of identity rather than economics. That is why the idea that you can do away with or reverse the rise of this new kind of politics by making people materially better off is for the birds, in my view, because that's not what they're bothered about. What they're bothered about is non-material factors, the fact that they feel that their life is insecure and that it's being subject to changes that they don't like and over which they have no control. And so, as it says, that's the final point there. And so those are the kind of things that I mentioned there. And in particular, as I say, one thing you could perhaps change is housing, which has become a major element in the precarity that people feel. But the, if you look at all that list there, it's only the top one that is actually broadly economic and can be addressed through economic measures. And this is where we are right now. What you have in every country pretty much, certainly in the UK, is that you've got two broad blocks. A nationalist bloc on one side, a cosmopolitan bloc on the other. They're roughly 50-50 in most countries. There's very little movement between the two. There are very, very few voters who will move from one side to the other of this divide at the moment. But there's intense competition within the two blocs to see which party is the dominant force within it. So there's a knockdown, drag-out fight between Conservatives and Reform right now, or between Labour and the Greens, to see which of them is going to be the dominant force in their side of this new divide. And each 50% has a kind of hard populist 30 to 40% and a more moderate 10 to 20%. And the more moderate people are essentially the remnants at the moment of the left and right of the old alignment. And if you're not careful, you end up with a three-way division of the kind you see in France. And as I say at the bottom here, that's not sustainable. It produces a quite literal Mexican standoff. So in the French Assembly Nationale at the moment, you've got three groups roughly the same size. If any one of them forms a government, the other two are going to combine against it and vote it down. But no two are prepared to cooperate with each other. So it is a Mexican standoff. And that's the rest of it, which I'll leave you with that actually, because that final part, because that is something that you might want to raise in the Q&A, but I'll stop there.
Thanks for the presentation. I would like to start with a personal question from you. You wrote this book as a historian, and as Thomas Hobbes said, a writer of history should be a foreigner without a country. And you said in a podcast a couple of months ago that this is not a work of advocacy.
Yes.
But so many people, because of that, they may assume to put you in the group of post-liberals who are embracing this change. But from what I've heard, from what you're saying, you don't see this development as a positive thing. Why is that?
Well, so I'm a classical liberal, which means I'm in that kind of consistent libertarian quadrant of the old alignment, basically. And so as far as I'm concerned, this new kind of politics is the diametric opposite of everything I believe. So if I was having a dialogue with, I don't know, someone like Owen Jones, for example, we would disagree severely about economic issues, but we would agree about other things. So, I remember a few years ago, Owen had a column in The Guardian about what complete disaster the Metropolitan police were and how they should be completely shut down. And my only disagreement with him was that I thought he'd been a bit too mild on them and hadn't been quite harsh enough. So the point is, whereas with somebody like, the RN in France, the National Rally, they're wrong about everything as far as I'm concerned. So this is not something I welcome. But as you say, I wrote this book as a historian because too many books about contemporary politics, it seems to me, are works of advocacy rather than analysis. And sure, there's a time and a place for works of advocacy. I might write a book of advocacy at some point. But what I want to do is to try and put my historian's hat on and explain what is going on. So I wrote the book essentially thinking, well, okay, if I was a historian writing from 150 years in the future, but only knowing what happened up to 2026, what would I write? And so that's the approach I took. And I'm very much in the kind of Leopold von Ranke view of history, that your job as a historian is to simply describe what actually happened, as the great man said. And so you should strive to be as dispassionate and detached as possible. And so that's what I have done. And so some people may therefore think that I'm in favour of the things I describe, but actually, no, I'm not.
You talked about being a consistent libertarian. About a year and a half ago, you wrote for CAPEX that the Reagan fusionist coalition of free markets and social conservatism is dead.
Yes.
It seems that combination of social conservatism and plus free market economics is a political impossibility right now. My question is, why the right abandoned the free market?
Because, well, okay, I strongly believe still that the kind of fusionist coalition that you had with the Reagan administration in the United States and subsequently, and indeed with the Thatcher government here in the UK, is done for, basically. There are still lots of people who, if you like, hanker after it and want to kind of put Humpty Dumpty back together again. I think that's what Nigel Farage and Richard Tice are about, essentially. But that's not what their voters are about, and they're going to find that this is not going to work. Now, why has the right abandoned free markets? Why is it that the, if you like, broadly social conservatives, not just social conservatives, by the way, because a lot of people in this new right, like Donald Trump, are not really social conservatives. If you read Trump's interviews over many, many years, he's not a social conservative. That's why he's stripped all the anti-abortion and anti-gay rights planks out of the Republican platform at the last election. Why did they abandon free markets? Well, it's because they now favour, that for them now, the big issue, the thing they care about more than anything else, is things like immigration and national identity. And if that's what is the main thing for you, it's very, very difficult to continue to support a globalised form of capitalism. One of the things I argue in the book is that actually, regardless of what they say initially, the new right that's appearing is going to have to move to the left on economics, because if you have a globally integrated investment market, which is what we've had since the mid-1980s really, then you must have, as we did between 1870 and 1914, a global labour market, an integrated labour market with large-scale labour flows. So if you want to stop those large-scale labour flows, you're going to have to do things like imposing exchange controls, which is not compatible with the kind of free market system that the right used to be in favour. And so that, in my view, is why they're steadily moving away from it.
To build up on your point, Bill Clinton said when he was president that it's not possible to advance the security of American workers by building walls of protection around the economy. Choice is to take the new world head-on, to compete and to win. It's quite ironic that your Republican president right now is in a fight with his Supreme Court over tariffs. But my question goes back to classical liberals themselves. Do you think now that the right is abandoning the free markets, maybe a part of that is fault of the free marketeers for only making the economic case for free markets rather than the more broad moral case of rule of law, anti-corruption stances?
I agree completely with that, yes. And I think that what happened after roughly the late 1980s on both the then left and the then right was that both sides, and again this is in the book, they lost belief in politics. They lost belief and confidence in politics as a way of persuading people and achieving change. And instead they both moved on to a kind of technocratic managerial model. And so on the free market side, what that meant was that they gave up on the idea of a more broadly social or moral case for a free society, one that was not just about efficiency, which I think we have too much of actually, and economic productivity. And so a huge amount of what you might call the liberal tradition was lost. Similarly, on the left, I think something similar happened there, and that's what needs to be recovered, because what you've got at the moment is a very kind of thick moral argument being made by people on the new right, and that's what needs to be addressed. You can't simply say, oh, if you do this, you're going to be, reduce GDP. No, that's not a persuasive argument, to put it mildly.
We talked a lot about the new right, and the subtitle of this event was Why the New Right is Here to Stay. But let's talk a bit about the new left. In the Telegraph, you wrote that across the Anglosphere, the left is turning its back on the working class. And you argued that if someone from the Labour Party conference from 1970 attended the Labour Party conference this year, they wouldn't recognize that party.
No.
My question is, how did the middle class, in a sense, hijack the leftist parties?
It's not so much the middle class. It's more what you've got going on is partly a transformation of the working class, which is associated with the decline of classical heavy industries, staple industries of one kind or another. So what you've now got is what is still, if you're going to put a Marxist hat on, a working class. It's still a proletariat by that kind of definition, but it now consists essentially of public sector service workers, white-collar workers of various kinds, but also increasingly people in what you might call lower rank middle management, people who are engaged in essentially process work that involves conducting and organising processes according to rules. And what has happened, of course, is that's led to a transformation of left-wing politics, because the constituency to which the politicians are appealing is different in terms of its physical experience, physical location in many cases, to what it used to be before. And that's brought about transformation of left-wing politics. So if you understand working class to mean the kind of traditional blue-collar worker who works in a shipyard or a factory or something of that sort, there are far fewer of them, for one thing. Certainly in the developed countries, I mean that kind of economic activity has migrated to other parts of the world, but also they're no longer the dominant force on the left. The left is now much more about organising a different kind of social constituency, and that's brought a different kind of set of preferences. Yeah.
Do you think the new left would be more like Mamdani and Polanski that we're seeing in the polls than the centrists?
Yeah, at the moment there is. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is how when that kind of technocratic consensus appeared after the fall of the Berlin Wall in the 1990s, there was a reaction against it on both the left and the right. And on the right, you had people like Pat Buchanan and the Paul Craig Roberts and a bunch of other people in the United States who, if you look at what they were advocating for and arguing for in, say, roughly 2000, late 1990s, it's Trump's agenda, essentially. But they were defeated by the dominant factions in the right in the United States at the time, and they were like marginalised. But there was something else on the left. There was this anti-globalisation left, radical left that saw the big protests at Seattle when the WTO was set up. Now that kind of left also then, faded. It was defeated by the social democratic left, people like Blair and Schroeder and Clinton. But they again have resurged recently. And so I think Mamdani and people like the Green Party here in the UK at the moment, they are articulating a form of left politics that's speaking to the sort of conditions I'm talking about up there, precarity and so on, much more effectively. As I say, their big problem is that they don't really yet have a worked out international political economy. They don't really know how they're going to organise the international system, if you will. The new right has a better idea of that, even though, again, they're still trying to work it out.
Before going to the audience for the questions, I would like to ask my last question, which is about democracy itself. As so many polls, we are seeing that the younger generation is preferring a more authoritarian system than to the current democratic system that we want, because they think it's not delivering. My question is, would this Great Realignment change the whole democratic systems that we live under, in your opinion?
Arguably, that's something where we'll still have to see. One of the very alarming things at the moment is the number of people under the age of 30, regardless of whether they self-identify as left or right, who say that you need to have a kind of strong dictatorial leader to get things done. This is really bad news. You do not want lots of people to think that way. And I think this is a reflection of something which is undoubtedly real, which is the paralysis of effective government that we can see at the moment. And that's partly to do with the way in which we have created a legal system where everything is subject to an enormous number of rules, and you can see this all the time. So I was in China for a month last year, and I was incredibly impressed by the Chinese high-speed rail system. And in the last 10 years, the Chinese have built, 10, 15 years, the Chinese have built 56,000 miles of high-speed rail. And in the same period, we have not built HS2, although we have spent £100 million on a back tunnel. Now, and similarly in California, Gavin Newsom and the Democrats in California have not built more than, I think it's 1.5 miles of high-speed rail between San Diego and the Bay Area. And this perception, I think, has gained ground across the spectrum right now, that you've got a government, regardless of whether it's left or right, which is simply completely ineffectual and unable to actually do anything. And I think addressing that problem is vitally important, because if you don't address that, that's when people do start hankering after a man on a white horse, basically. Now, the obvious response to that is, well, be careful you don't get what you wish for. It may not be, quite what you imagine or what is good, but the problem is you can see why there is this enormous feeling of frustration, I think, the kind of ineffectuality of politics, and you can see the politicians feel this as well. So, several Labour ministers have said that they've discovered since they came into power a year ago that they pull on all these levers and nothing happens. Basically, it appears that there's this kind of enormous amorphous blob, as it's currently called, that stops you actually doing anything. And I think that's a very important issue to address, regardless of what your politics are.
Now we go to the audience for the questions, Q&A.
Yes.
I've been thinking about this topic for a while because it's very interesting, and there's something I stumbled upon, which is that the Western culture, inspired by Western, I mean the Protestant North European countries, inspired by Protestantism, have this universalism, right? It comes straight from the religion. It's like anyone who believes, and from that we, get the ideas that everyone is equal, everyone should be treated the same, and so on and so forth. And from this we get stuff like a universal welfare state and a national health service that treats everybody. And into this universalist culture, we've had mass migration of cultures who are not universalist at all, but they have an extreme in-group preference. And so, well, I could be totally wrong, but the way that I see it is it's into this universalist culture, you get all of these cultures with a strict in-group preference, and then the universalist people start to realize, hang on a second, if they only look after themselves, and if they refuse to look after us, then we'll just do the same thing. And the high-trust universalist society comes crashing down. And I know you haven't spoken about this, but this is what I see with my own eyes, right?
It is a major phenomenon, and the real conflict there is between, if you like, I can't think of the name of the author now, but it's the idea that you have a weird culture, which, we capitalise, it's an acronym, one element of which is universalist individualism, essentially. And the obvious contrast to that is a society, of which there are many, of course, around the world, which is dominated by extended kin groups, the rule of the clan, if you will. And one of the strongest predictors of that sociologically is having very high levels of consanguinity in marriage. If you're in a part of the world where people tend to marry their cousins, you're going to end up with very strong endogamous kin groups, but where there is very limited movement from one endogamous kin group to another. And that works against this idea of universality, because the basic idea is you trust your relatives, but you don't really trust other people to the same degree. Now, the thing is, though, this is not new. This is in many ways part of the contest or stress between modernity and non-modern forms of society. And so, for example, if you look at the United States in the previous great wave of migration in the 1870 to 1924 period, you had mass migration from parts of the world like Sicily, Calabria, southern Italy, which again had a strongly extended family-based system. Also Ireland, and also the shtetl, the Pale of Settlement in the Russian Empire. And that's one of the reasons why, if you look at, say, organised crime in the United States in the first half of the 20th century, it's dominated by, guess what, Irish, Italian Americans and Jewish Americans. Because if you do have that kind of strong, inward-looking, non-universalist family system, it gives you a definite advantage in being involved in organised crime, because it means you're less likely to be betrayed to the police. Quite a contrast to, say, German immigrants to the United States or Scandinavian immigrants who didn't have that phenomenon. But okay, you end up with Tony Soprano, but the whole point about that, TV series in a way, is that the system that Tony has grown out of is breaking down, because that's what capitalism does, in my view. Capitalism has this enormous solvent effect upon those kinds of strong group loyalties. Now, what you may argue is, well, we don't have time to wait for that. It's too long to wait. And also, and I think this is a point, there is a tension between having a large number of people in your society who are strongly in-group, have strong in-group preferences, and having a universalist welfare state. I think that's a particular problem, which of course you didn't have in the United States before really the 1960s. I mean, I know you've got the New Deal, but it doesn't really create a welfare state. So it does raise all kinds of very acute political challenges. That's undoubtedly true. But I'm not going to throw my hands up and say, well, no, these two things are incompatible. I do believe in the power of simple ways of living, above all the simple fact of urbanisation, to undermine that kind of strong in-group preference society. Yes?
Isn't populism usually used as a disparaging term?
Yes.
Whereas, isn't it really just democracy in action? And isn't it a reaction against the globalist elites who have let the people down over a wide range of issues, like allowing uncontrolled immigration?
I don't like the term populism for a number of reasons. I got a big chunk of the first chapter of the book where I just say why I don't like it. The problem with populism as a category of analysis is it has no precise content. It's a form of word which refers to a style and rhetoric rather than to a precise content. The only kind of content it has is the idea that there's a people who are being slighted or disregarded, ignored, mistreated by an elite, which is
Yeah, but
that's your point. Yes, that's your argument. Now,
yes.
I think there is an element of truth in that, which is that although I'm not on the side of the populace, what has driven a lot of people to complete distraction is the belief, I think well-founded belief, that they may have certain political preferences, concerns, but these are just not being paid attention to. You know, they're not being addressed. And in fact, what you do get instead is the idea that if you raise certain issues, you should be banned from politics, which we've seen with Marine Le Pen, although admittedly there was something else going on there in that particular case, because she's not the only one in French politics that's had that done to her, but more clearly in Romania. Now, my own view is that this populist response is wrong, but it's a big mistake, both strategically and also morally, to simply dismiss it and refuse to engage with it. What you need to do is to actually have a debate with it, is my argument. And that's what elites have refused to do. And by refusing to do it, what they actually do is to make this response or reaction more extreme and more radical than it would otherwise be. And the historical comparison I make is with the rise of organised working class movements in the late 19th and early 20th century, when the political class at the time in various countries simply refused to address the kind of issues that this new Labour socialist movement was raising. And the result was that a lot of it actually turned to the radical form, revolutionary forms of socialism, like communism. So from the point of view even of the elite themselves, the kind of simply ignoring concerns that lots of people have is actually counterproductive, it's self-defeating. So even though I'm not on the side of these populists, I understand why people are mad. Because, like I said, their views are just not being taken seriously. And you don't have to agree with somebody to take their views seriously.
I've got another one.
Yeah, sorry, question at the back there.
You spoke a little bit about the different parties and left-right fighting to be the dominant competitor. I just wondered if you could say a thing or two about how different electoral systems might play into some of the trends you're speaking about. Obviously, first past the post tends to lead to a two-party system, although, as you've kind of hinted at, we've seen a bit of a splintering in the UK recently. It was just it was also the following on from your kind of comment about you can't be a little bit in power. Well, yeah, that's true, but I mean, obviously, if you're in a kind of coalition situation, then your power to implement your whole agenda is slightly diminished because you have to negotiate with other parties in the coalition.
Yes, I mean, my argument in the book is that actually there's not as much difference as people imagine between a first-past-the-post system and a PR system as regards the binary division of politics. Because, sure, in a PR system, if you believe in Duverger's law, then you end up with two big parties, which are essentially portmanteau parties. They're de facto coalitions of subgroups, which in a PR system would be separate parties.
But whereas in a PR system you have like lots and lots of parties, how many depends on the precise form the PR system takes. But even in a PR system, what you find is there's two broad blocks. So in Sweden, everyone knows there's the bourgeois bloc, as they call it, and then on the other hand, there's the Social Democrats on the left. Similarly, in the Netherlands, everyone knows that there's a right bloc and there's a left bloc, and everyone knows which party is in which bloc very clearly. And so it's not actually that much different. So you still have to, you say, well, you're not really in power if you're in a coalition. Well, that's a bit like being one of the minority tendencies in a single big portmanteau party in the first past the post system. You still don't have real power because the majority of your parliamentary colleagues maybe don't share your views, or the leadership of your party doesn't really just wants to throw you the odd bone every so often. But on the other hand, I do think that electoral systems have a part to play in something else, which is this: in a first past the post system, it's much more difficult to set up an insurgent party. And so what that does is to make the process of realignment both longer and more drawn out, and yet when it happens, more sudden. Because when you have a first past the post system, what you're finding and seeing is that you get the build-up of the realignment. The voters start to realign a different way, but it takes a lot longer for that to manifest itself at the electoral level, because in a PR system, you can set up a new party, like the AFD, for example, which suddenly goes over several elections from virtually nothing, 4-point-something%, to wherever it is now, 27, 28% last polls. But where, on the other hand, that's a kind of gradual process, where in the first past the post system, you get a sudden kind of abrupt, apparent reset in which that underlying realignment suddenly becomes impossible to contain anymore. Now, that's particularly true in the Anglosphere countries, I think, because Anglosphere politics is unusually dependent upon donors. And that's because, well, there's various reasons for that. I think it's because, essentially, of the overwhelmingly dominant view of television, role of television in Anglosphere politics, which is not true to the same degree in other countries. And television campaigning is really expensive. And so that means that if you're relying on television, you rely on donors, basically. And the donors, the rich investors in politics, have not realigned in the way that ordinary voters have. Because if you're a rich person, the issue of identity is not really salient for you. You're probably a global businessman, for one thing. And what you're really concerned about still is how much tax you're paying and how much the government is interfering in how you run your business. And so the donors are very reluctant to adapt to and accept this new world of politics. And so that's holding it back in the Anglophone countries. But I think that the United States being an interesting exception, the United States is a peculiar case, because unique in my view, because in the US, the two political parties are integrated into the actual administration of the electoral system in a way that's not true anywhere else. And that makes it effectively impossible, not just difficult, impossible for any kind of third party to either get moderate representation in Congress or challenge one of the existing parties. Hasn't happened since the 1850s, unlike Canada, for example. And what you also, though, have in the United States is the primary system. And what that means is it's possible for grassroots insurgencies to take over and transform a party in a way that's not true, say, here in the UK, as we've seen with both the Labour and the Tory parties. So I think it has quite an effect, but not ultimately in terms of the way politics is organised. So I think that the fundamental structure of politics is the same pretty much everywhere, regardless of what electoral system you've got. Yes?
Why have cosmopolitan parties struggle to shift towards more moral arguments in the way that nationalist parties have?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Why have cosmopolitan parties struggle to shift from economic arguments to moral arguments in the way that national parties?
Oh, good question. I think because simply they are the parties that in the most recent past were the most successful with this kind of technocratic politics, basically. And also, essentially, in terms of their personnel, they're full of policy wonks who've been brought up and trained to think in terms of A, media manipulation, and B, technical solutions to economic and social problems. And so the moral language of politics has kind of deserted both the centre-right and the centre-left, I think. And so that's why they are finding it hard to adapt to this, basically. I think they will adapt. It's as much of having a new generation as of anything else. And, you know, you do see some politicians, both then and now, in the recent past and now, who are more comfortable with that kind of moral register. So I think Gordon Brown, for example, when he was allowed to speak the way he wanted to, was very much a politician who thought in those kind of terms. But it's interesting that he was basically constantly under control by his SPADs and political advisors saying, no, you don't want to do that, you want to talk about GDP figures and how well the economy is doing, that kind of thing. And so I think it's basically the case that we've gone through a period from roughly the fall of the Berlin Wall, really before then, through to about now, where it was all about technical solutions to various problems. Whichever problem people came up with, it was understood in those kind of terms. And I think we're now beginning to move out of that, but it's taken the parties that were on top in that period a while to adapt to it. That's my explanation. We'll have to see if they do adapt, but they should do. Yep.
So just connected to that, does that suggest that in order for cosmopolitans to kind of reclaim the moral argument, there is going to have to be quite significant institutional reform? You spoke about SPADs, being able to kind of warn political voices away from that kind of moral rhetoric. Do we need the end, or if you are trying to be successful as a cosmopolitan, do we need the end of that kind of institutionalized politics that we currently have in order to achieve?
Yeah, very much so. But actually not just on that particular, not just for them. Again, this is one of the themes of the book, is one of the things that's happened over my lifetime has been the progressive and steady decline and decay of the political party as a social and political entity. So when I was very young, in the 60s, the Conservative Party had 2 million members. The Labour Party had 1.5 million members, plus an even larger number of people who were affiliated through the various unions. They were major civil society organisations. And in many parts of the country, the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, or both in some places, was the dominant centre of a lot of social life. Now, nothing like that now. They're shell organisations, basically. And that has been incredibly damaging, in my view, for the way politics is conducted. And so the institutional reform we need is to recreate politics as a kind of mass social phenomenon. And the thing about those parties was that a lot of what they did and a lot of what the organisation did was not overtly or explicitly political. So the Young Conservatives were famously the Western world's largest dating agency and marriage bureau. That was conventionally the way you got hitched up in certain circles. Similarly, the Labour Party did a whole range of other stuff through the Workers' Education Association, things like that, which is not overtly political. It was massive, not least here at the LSE. That was all part of where it got started, the WAA. And that's what we need to recover, in my view. That's the kind of institutional reform we need. And the key thing is to not rely upon electronic media for political communication and mobilisation. Now, actually, the person who gives us hope in this regard, strangely, is Donald Trump. Because I remember when he was running for president the first time, I was at an event organised by the Institute of Economic Affairs, which I also work for. I was with a chap, Tyler Cowen. Tyler's a pretty well-known economist. And I said to him, informally, what do you think of Trump's chances for winning? I was interested, because I just bet on Trump to win, you see. I got odds of 11 to 1. And I sort of tried pretty good odds. I'm going to take these because my view was if he got the nomination, he was going to win the general. And Tyler said, he's not going to win. He's not spending anywhere near enough money, and he hasn't got enough television time. And yet, he actually spent half as much money as Hillary Clinton. And he had all these rallies and mass meetings. Everyone was saying, this is old-fashioned rubbish politics. What you need is attack ads and things. Well, we all know the outcome. He won the election. Similarly, the last election, Kamala Harris spent way more money and the Democrats generally spent way more money than Trump and the Republicans, on TV ads mainly. But Trump was able to get over the line and win quite comfortably through a reversion back to old-fashioned politics, mass meetings, banging on people's doors, and that kind of thing. Zohran Mamdani, again, in New York, is exactly the same kind of politics. He was going around, meeting people in the street, talking to people in shopping centres and all this kind of stuff. So I'm actually quite hopeful that we are going to see a move away from this kind of completely deracinated politics that we've had. But you're right, we do. We need a major institutional reform. I do remember Ken Livingstone describing spin doctors as a form of political pond life, which is a view I share, basically.
So the climate today is very different. So today people will literally stop being friends with somebody if they have a different political opinion to them. And so I think, you can have millions of people in the political parties in like a tolerant society, but in today's world, there is so much intolerance where it's like, that guy's a Tory, they're no longer my friend, which is a very real thing. Maybe we need the tolerance back first.
Maybe. I think what you need is not so much tolerance as civility, which is not the same thing. You can say, you refuse to be friends with somebody, but still treat them with common courtesy. That's a different thing. It's a matter of how public discourse is organised. I think we tend to think that, we've never been as polarised as we are now. And this is nonsense, quite honestly. If you think that, say, American politics is polarised to an unprecedented degree, you should read about the kind of stuff that went on in the 1800 election, where a lot of the Federalists were quite literally and seriously saying that Thomas Jefferson was the Antichrist. And that if he won the election, it would mark the... And strangely, this should have meant they wanted him to win the election, because it would have meant that the second coming was imminent if he won. Similarly, if you look at, say, political divisions in many parts of the world, including Britain at various times, let's say in the 1880s, 1890s, unbelievably bitter. But what you had was a set of understood rules about how engagement worked, and rules about public norms of civility. So although people were incredibly intolerant, if you will, of each other's views, not prepared to associate socially with people, hence the famous W.S. Gilbert line about, being born either a liberal or a conservative, there was still a kind of understood way in which political discourse was meant to work, which meant that you didn't have the kind of toxic exchanges that you now get. And I agree, that is damaging. The other thing, by the way, is that there's the dynamics of conflict. If you, what you really want to avoid is a situation where the extreme, the tails, if you like, of the distribution of views come to drive and dominate debate and argument. Because what that leads to is the perception that politics is existential. And if the other side wins, because you now identify the other side with the tail of their distribution of views, it's going to be the end of everything. That's an extremely dangerous view to have, because it can lead to really disastrous outcomes. You saw that with the, in America, for example, in the 1850s, where there was the famous occasion where this Southern Congressman, Preston Brooks, walked into the Senate and beat up Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts with his cane, and nearly killed him. It took Sumner like 2 years to recover. And the thing was that after this, he was sent back home to South Carolina in disgrace, and it was like a triumphal tour. Now, the fact is that the fire eaters in the South and the radical abolitionists in the North were the extreme tail ends of their respective distributions, but the impression gained ground at that time in the US that if the other side won, it was going to be those radicals who would be in charge, and that led to a civil war, because they weren't prepared to accept it. So I think a big part of the problem is the way in which so much contemporary politics is conducted on social media, where the algorithms do lead you to think that the people you're engaging with are all in the tail end of the other side's distribution. And that's something very dangerous at the moment, I think.
I think we have time for just one last quick question, if anyone has that.
Yeah.
Just one last question.
Yeah, you talked about a trend where you believe that younger men are going to be more attracted towards, moving more towards the right. Can you tell us anything more about that?
Well, that's just a matter of the evidence. If you look at the tendency over, as measured by polls and surveys over the last 10 years in a number of continental European countries, what you've seen is a steady migrational movement of men under the age of 30 to the so-called populist right. It's very not marked in Germany, although there's a kind of significant geographical variation as well. Very marked in France. Much less marked amongst young women. And in the United States, what you can see right now from, again, this kind of evidence, is a quite dramatic polarisation amongst the under 30s, with younger women moving much more clearly into a kind of progressive left position, younger men moving much more clearly into a kind of MAGA right position. So it's not clear this is happening everywhere, but where we do have evidence of that kind from surveys, focus groups, various kinds of opinion polls as to who's going to vote for whom, that does appear to be the phenomenon that we're getting. Now, quite what is driving this is not clear to me. I'm not sure I know what it is. One of the kind of, part of the undergrowth of this realignment that I'm talking about is the growth of a kind of culture amongst a lot of very online young men, so-called manosphere, which believes that masculinity and being a man is under threat at the moment, and that seems to be part of this phenomenon that then manifests in populist politics. Now, quite what is going on there and why this is happening, I'm not sure myself, but as a kind of observable phenomenon, I'm just like observing it really and saying that seems to be the trend, if you will, and therefore it's what is likely to happen.
Okay. We're going to wrap things up. Thanks for the question and attending, and thanks to the LSE Hayek program and Steve for this great speech.
Thank you. And remember, go and buy the book. I've brought along a couple of proof copies of anybody, just a few typos in there. So.